I'm choosing to do my research project over Harriet Tubman. I decided to choose this because there are so many things our students can learn from her. It can range from leadership to education, the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln, and slavery. I would begin the lesson by reading the children a story about Harriet Tubman. It would be Moses, how Harriet Tubman led her people to freedom. I think this is a great book to use because it introduces Harriet Tubman and shows great illustrations for the children to see and see what her living conditions might have looked like. In this book, Harriet mentions a specific line that says, "When the old chariot comes, I'm going to leave you." This specific line can be used to tie into the song "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," and this is how you'll get your children engaged through music. Some of the tactics that they used to escape on the Underground Railroad were done through music. We talked about the song "Follow the Drinking Gourd," and that helped lead the slaves north, but there were other songs that they used, such as "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." And if the slaves heard this song, then that meant that they needed to be ready to flee because it was about to be their time to run and move on to the next station. After discussing slavery, Harriet Tubman, and the Underground Railroad, I think you could begin to talk to your children about Harriet Tubman as a person. Talk about her childhood and how she got to be a conductor on the Underground Railroad. You could talk with them about how slaves weren't allowed to have an education, to read or write, and that could really hinder them. Harriet Tubman didn't know what year she was born in. It was never recorded because they weren't allowed to know stuff like that, and even if they did know, they would not have been able to record it. A lot of stories and biographies we read about Harriet don't always have her opinion or her side of the story written down because she was not literate. This information came from a peer-reviewed journal called "We May Never Know the Real Harriet Tubman." I think this is an interesting point to make, and I had not thought about it, but I think it could be a good motivator for our children to be involved in their education, and it's important that we don't take our education for granted. We won't always be able to rely on others, and it's important that we can tell our own story. Also, Harriet was a great leader. She was a thinker and a doer. You could discuss this with your students and discuss what qualities it is you want in a great leader. This conversation could also be tied into character building with your students and also anti-bullying. The second peer-reviewed journal I found is called Still They Come. It talks about how people still remember hearing stories from their family members about their experience on the Underground Railroad. It mentions that these stories are an important part of African American literature. Slave narratives is how they're often referred to, and they're often called the first genre of African American literature. A great children's story to read is Henry's Freedom Box. This story gives a little more information about what it was like to be a slave and how they escaped. It's also based on a true story of the Underground Railroad. After researching this topic and getting some more insight on Harriet Tubman, I think it would be an easy lesson to tie into other subject areas besides social studies. They can use it in music to listen and decode songs they used to communicate indirectly with the slave, language arts by reading the books, character building by talking about the type of person you should strive to be, and lastly, math if you wanted to figure out how many miles it was until they got to freedom. There are a lot of opportunities to mix this lesson with other subjects.